Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd Interviews. I'm Chris Alvarez and thank you for watching. I'm speaking with Dr. Ula Klein, author of Sapphic Crossings, Cross-Dressing Women in 18th-Century British Literature, published by University of Virginia Press, February 4th, 2021. Thank you for speaking.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me, and here is my book.
There's the book cover. Yes.
Yeah.
Full book cover.
Thank you.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing a book on this subject?
Well, I was in grad school doing my PhD in English, and I took a class on 18th century British novels, and I'd never read anything in that time period before. I was interested more in Victorian literature.
Mhm.
And then I took this class, and I was really struck by kind of how crazy 18th century literature was compared to Victorians.
Mm.
It just seemed so much wilder, with characters, falling out of carriages and having duels. And it just seemed a lot, kind of wilder and crazier. And there were so many women characters who were dressing in men's clothing. And I had no idea that that was a thing at all. And that even some of these women were historical personages, like real women in the past who had passed themselves off as men for one reason or another, and just got really interested in why that is and why that was such a popular character in the 18th century, when we tend to think of that time period, any time period before the 20th century, as being very kind of anti any kind of gender play. Right. So I was like, how is it that people were reading this and knowing about these women, and they were excited about them and they found them fascinating? And this is before you have a lesbian or gay or transgender identity as we know it today. So that got me really thinking, like, what's going on here? And I want to know more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the interesting things when I came across your book was that, I'm familiar with plenty of actors dressing as women for parts in theater. That seemed almost
Mm-hmm.
commonplace, or I guess it was commonplace. But from your book blurb, it was the flip of that. So yeah, tell me how do you break out the book? Do you touch on different books, or how do you lay it out?
Well, I wanted every chapter to have some reference to a novel that had a cross-dressing element or cross-gender representation. But then there's a lot of kind of a lot of representations in the archives in like print culture. So pamphlets, ballads, kind of stuff that was printed, on the cheap, right? That people could buy, just like a short story or like a little mini biography, or a criminal biography. Those are very popular. So I wanted to combine genres. So what I ended up doing is I didn't end up organizing the book by like novel versus play versus print culture. I ended up organizing it by different body parts that seemed to be important to this project, this enterprise of cross-dressing. So many different stories would say things like, oh, she looked just like a young boy, but a little too feminine because she didn't have a beard. She didn't have a 5 o'clock shadow, right? She had a smooth face. And so that got me thinking, like, well, what is the role of beardedness when it comes to establishing gender? Because gender obviously played a big role in desire and sexuality at this time. So I started thinking about those different body parts, and I noticed that facial hair, breasts, genitalia, and legs were these kind of body parts or parts of the body that came up over and over again as problematic for gender passing or sexually exciting or titillating. So I decided that I would organize my chapters around those body parts, and then I would, choose different texts that talked about those body parts for each chapter.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. One of the things I also look into, I go to a lot of conventions where there's a lot of cosplay, and
Oh,
I've
cool.
noticed that lately, you see a lot more. Well, you've always had women cosplaying male characters, but I've noticed a lot more use of like drawing in beards and mustaches to establish the character they're playing. So it just made me interested in your topic and comparing it to modern day, people
Mhm.
playing, you know, different genders or
Yeah, and
opposite
I
gender.
feel like I've met people now who do drag king performances, which is kind of exciting
Mhm,
and different. Like I think people are really familiar with drag queens because of shows like Drag Race.
mhm,
But there are women who have these male personas who perform as drag kings.
mhm,
And then on top of that, there's been more, I think, in popular culture for sure, with shows like Gentleman Jack, about Anne Lister, who's a little bit beyond my time period. She's kind of like into the 19th century, which is why I don't write a whole lot about her in my book.
mhm.
Maybe in the next project.
Yeah.
But Alfred Nobbs, that movie with Glenn Close, where she plays a 19th century woman who lived essentially as a man,
Mhm,
dressed as a man. So I started thinking also about how this has become a kind of a touchstone, and people are more and more interested in these histories. Um, and the show um Black Flag. No, wait, what is it called? It's
the pirate show?
yeah, the pirate show.
I think it's Black Flag.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So that show actually has the real life person Anne Bonny as a character,
mhm,
and she was also a cross dressing woman
mhm,
in this popular criminal biography called The History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson.
mhm.
Um, and so I just thought, wow, there's a lot going on in popular culture with representations of female-bodied people dressing in men's clothing, passing themselves off as men. There's more and more interest in this, and that kind of fits in well with the project that I was working on in grad school. And that's why I was like, okay, I'm going to turn it into a book for
Mhm.
publication as opposed to just the dissertation.
So obviously there's a difference between dressing as a man to pose as a man for some reason versus dressing
Mhm.
as a man because you feel, a woman feels like a man. So is that explored in your book?
Yes, yes. There's been a lot of interest in thinking about transgender studies in kind of how they relate to people in the past.
Mhm,
And of course, the identity of transgender is a modern kind of it's a modern name, right?
mhm,
The word is not in existence before the 20th century. And so there's a question, right? How would you talk about people in the past
mhm,
if we don't know what they felt,
mhm,
right? Um, because there's a lot of theories. Did someone like Hannah Snell, who's on the cover of my book,
mhm,
did she dress as a soldier because she really just was going to go look for her husband, right? Or is that something that was put into the biography in order to kind of normalize it,
mhm,
right? We don't really know because we can't go back in time and interview her. And we know that when she came back to England, she dressed in women's clothing again and she married a man. Um, but one thing that really surprised me was when I looked into the archives, you can actually find quite a few newspaper clippings, like really short little notices about women who had lived as men for decades and were not discovered to be female bodied until they died and there was
mhm,
an autopsy performed.
mhm,
And their wives would often say, "Oh no, I had no idea. I thought she was a man.
mhm,
She acted like a man to me in the bedroom, wink, wink."
mhm,
Um, so I think that there's a lot of ambiguity,
mhm,
right? And we can never say for sure how someone felt, whether they were doing something out of necessity or because she was female bodied and she was in love with other women, and the only way to do that and not get in trouble was to dress as a man,
mhm,
or was it about a gender identity?
mhm.
Um, that's one of the things that I kind of think a little bit about, or a lot about, even in my
Mhm.
book.
Yeah.
How do we understand the representation of cross gender people in the past when every single representation of them in text is so fraught, right? It's uncertain. It's often
Mhm,
told from a third person's point of view,
mhm,
someone who might be trying to sell, a scandalous tale.
mhm.
There's this other kind of aspect of trying to sell these stories and make money off of them, and maybe hype up the scandalousness, but or downplay it so it doesn't get censored.
Right. Yeah.
um, so there's a lot of reading between the lines. and speculation. And I try to be as sensitive as I can to the many different possibilities embodied by these people and the people who wrote about them.
I'm speaking with Dr. Ula Klein, author of Sapphic Crossings. You can find more information about her work at saphiccrossings.weebly.com. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you want daily book suggestions for new fiction and nonfiction studies in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mysteries, gaming, game design, film history, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Now back to the video. Well, it actually, and I feel like I should apologize in a sense, because I use the word, someone who feels like they're a different identity, and that sort of downplays to use the word feel, instead of identifies, seems to downplay it. So that sort of also makes me think of the question, if an individual identified with a different sex than they are biologically, how could you analyze that in older literature or older, any kind of information? How do you kind of break it out? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's actually something that I was asking myself a lot, because I was working on this in grad school, and I was thinking primarily of these women as like kind of early lesbians, that they were dressing in men's clothing so that they could woo other women, court other women. And frequently they're represented as being kind of feminine despite their masculine clothing. And they're often represented as being attractive to other women precisely because they're kind of feminine or androgynous, which suggests that some of these women, not cross-dressed women, were attracted to the cross-dresser, not because of her masculine appearance, but because of this femininity about her. Which, if you think about, how popular someone like Leonardo DiCaprio was in the 90s, and he was a little bit more smooth-faced than now.
Right.
That idea that teen heartthrobs are often kind of androgynous, very boyish looking, it kind of goes into that ideal of androgynous beauty, which is linked right to Shakespeare's time as well, with boys playing women's roles on stage. So I was focusing primarily on the cross-dressing women as women. And I was at some conferences and people asked me point blank, they said, why are you not looking at these people as transgender?
Right.
And so I had to really think about that question. And I think the first part of that answer is, why was I thinking about it this way? I mean, obviously that was my research interest, but also that's often how they're represented by these authors. The authors are often scandalized, not necessarily by the gender crossing, but by the sexual transgression, right?
Yeah.
So they would often think of these women as being kind of, scandalous, not necessarily because they cross-dress, but because they were pursuing relationships with other women. So I think that's where I got the sense that, like, 18th century authors, for example, were interested in the sort of sapphic, right? That element of the representation. But it's true, if we think about this from a transgender studies or transgender history, we're trying to piece together the history of transgender people in the past. Certainly many of the people that I write about would be part of that history, a history where we have examples of people who dressed and maybe even lived as a gender that they were not, quote unquote, born as, right? Or signed at birth, let's say. So I think, to me, the way that you do that is that you keep an open mind and you tread lightly, right? And you keep those possibilities open. To me, that's the most important thing, is to think about the many different kinds of possibilities. Because, I mean, there's a bisexual history here as well, right? It's possible to also think about someone like Hannah Snell, who had at least two different husbands, but also who courted women while dressed as a man. It is possible to think of her as bisexual as well. Um, so I think that's where it gets exciting. If you start keeping things open, keep the possibilities open, then you might be able to find, more than one kind of history in the past, in the archive.
Right, right. How about the laws at this time? Did you get into the laws? How they,
A
was it
little
criminal?
bit,
Yeah.
a little bit. It's an interesting question because with gay men, the sodomy arrests and trial reports are some of the most powerful archival evidence for gay male desire in the past. But nothing like that really exists for women because there often weren't laws regarding female same-sex sexual liaison. Same-sex sex acts between women were not governed under sodomy laws. So there's a lot less of that. But again, you do occasionally get some of this with women who are called female husbands. And those were women who were caught courting women and then also convincing them to marry them under the guise that they were men. And they would continue the charade in the bedroom with the use of dildo. So this is when, if you were caught, right, and the dildo was the evidence against you, this is when, some of these women were actually strung up. I mean, in Europe, there was a couple of them who were caught and who were actually put to death, I think hanged. No one in England was ever, I think, hanged under those circumstances. But one of the women I write about, Mary Hamilton, who went under the name George Hamilton and courted several women, married several women, was bigamous in addition to being a woman. And she would actually defraud some of these women. She would, if they were getting too close to figuring out who she was, they would take their money and she would book it. So she eventually is arrested and charged with vagrancy.
Okay.
Yeah. And also kind of part of the charges are that she imposed on the people of this town, like she lied to them essentially. So she is charged with lying and with vagrancy, and nothing there's a sexual tinge to those, and everyone knew what was going on, but the official charges are not there's no they don't use the word sodomy or any other language relating to her sex, even though everyone knew that she had this illicit desire. So I think it's a little bit harder maybe when you're looking into the histories of female-bodied people, because they were often not subject to the law explicitly in the same way as men with sodomy.
Yeah, interesting. So let's turn back towards the actual clothing that was worn. And I'm curious, just, you have your nobility type of, or your upper class clothes, and you have your lower class clothes. Was there any what's the word I'm looking for? But what did you find that they tended to wear, when they were taking on a male persona?
I mean,
Or was there a difference?
they usually took on whatever the clothing of the class that they were from, usually, as far as I can tell. I know that in the case of Mary Hamilton, at least in the story about her, it says that she dresses as a Methodist minister at one point, and then also as a doctor. So it kind of seems like maybe middle class garb of some kind. In one of the fictional stories that I write about, there is a young lady, Leonora, who decides to cross-dress as a clergyman, because the clergy would wear kind of almost like they look like dresses in a way, right? And it's explained that, she's like, oh, well, it's almost going to be like wearing a dress, so I won't have to wear breeches, and it won't be quite so unladylike. And then with female soldiers, they're often dressing in their brother's clothing and then enlisting, and then they're in uniform. So I feel like cross-dressing was often the province of working class women and maybe middle class women. And as far as real life cross-dressers, or people who dressed in cross-gender appearance. You have the Chevalier d'Eon, who was a male-bodied person who was a soldier and was in the service of the King of France and was a courtier, so would have been wearing, kind of finer stuff, and then lives in England as a woman and also is often depicted as wearing quite fine clothing. So I think most people would stick to the class that they came from, and that makes sense at the time period because class was such an important determiner of your status. And there was a lot of anxiety about class crossing at masquerades, or the fact that, women would give their ladies servants, right? They would give them their cast off clothing, and then the servants would have to make them plainer, take off some of the decor on them so they wouldn't be quite as fancy. And there was a lot of concern, right? How will you know the class of people if they're all wearing the same clothing?
Yeah.
The servants are wearing the cast-offs from the lady of the house. If sex workers are wearing the same clothing as aristocratic ladies, how will we know, right, who is who?
Yeah.
So I think people tended to stick to what they knew. And it's also what could you get your hands on, right? Your brother's stuff, your father's stuff.
Yeah. I wondered if any of the type of clothing back then lent itself to more easily take on a male persona. I guess that was part of my question too. And you mentioned the clergy outfit, kind of in a sense. So
yeah, an easier kind of switch, right? But that's the only time I've seen that kind of decision. On stage managers wanted to cast women in men's roles, so they would wear these tight breeches and stockings to show off their legs, because women's legs were kind of taboo. They were under these big skirts. You didn't get to see women's legs. If you saw an ankle, it was scandalous.
Yeah.
So I think that there was a certain amount of excitement about wearing breeches and tights, that maybe was part of the allure of cross-dressing as well. And then also the fact that, those skirts were so bulky. I think in a lot of the stories, there seems to be a suggestion that, wearing trousers or breeches was just going to give you a lot more mobility, especially if you were going to be a female pirate aboard a ship, right? You're going to wear trousers that you can do all the heavy lifting in on the ship.
How about, I don't think we've touched on this yet, but how about men who would want women to dress as men, for, sexual play or any kind of anything like that? Did you come across any of that?
There is a little bit of that in John Cleland's novel, The Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, or Fanny Hill, which is a very early erotic novel of the mid 18th century. He's a British author. And there is a story, it's little vignettes. They're little erotic stories that are kind of nested within this larger story of this character, Fanny Hill. And it's just an excuse for, describing a lot of sex. And so one of the little stories about one of the friends that she has at this brothel is this young lady, Emily. They go to a masquerade and Emily dresses as a shepherd boy, I think it is. And she gets kind of picked up by a man. And it's not until they're about to have sex that she realizes that this man thinks that she is a young man, and that he wants to have anal sex with her. And of course, she's, freaking out because that's not what she was prepared for, apparently. And so there's this moment in the story where she reveals to the man, she's like, wait a minute, I'm a girl. And the man is disappointed. And he has to kind of cover it up somehow, right? And be like, oh, that's okay. So there is, and that's a story, it's a fictionalized story, but it does make you wonder, what were, again, what was the allure of this androgynous, youthful person, that it was going to be an alluring or attractive object of desire for men, for women. And that gets back to some of my really central interests in, what is happening with gender and how are people thinking about gender at this time? Why are these cross-gender people or androgynous people or people with mixed masculine and feminine characteristics, why are they so attractive? Why are they thought of as so interesting and attractive at this time?
How about you mentioned different aspects. Hair length, was that how indicative of that was it, at the time, was it, of gender?
I think it could be indicative because there are a couple places where the women talk about cutting their hair off.
Mhm,
Now, men didn't all have very short hair. If you wore a wig, you would keep it very short.
mhm,
Um, but obviously, not everyone wore a wig. If you were a working person, if you were a sailor, you
mhm,
probably were not wearing a wig.
right.
So women tended to have very long hair. So I think what a lot of them would do is they would just kind of chop it maybe like shoulder length, just long enough they could put it in a little ponytail at the back of their heads, which was not uncommon for gentlemen of the time.
Mhm,
Um, it's funny though, in a lot of the stories, they're a lot less concerned with the hair and way more concerned with facial hair.
mm,
There's all this like, oh, they're going to blacken their face, or she was called Molly Gray by the soldiers because she was so smooth faced. There's a lot of concern about not having facial hair, even though in the 18th century it wasn't popular to have a beard.
mm, okay.
But I guess the stubble, right? You didn't have any stubble, and so that was going to be suspicious.
Mm, okay.
Mm.
How about tattoos?
Oddly enough, that did not come up in
Mm,
my research at all. I hadn't even thought about that, about like
mm,
military men having tattoos or sailors.
sailors, yeah.
I
But
don't even know how popular that was in the 18th century at all. I have to
yeah,
make a note for myself. Tattoos.
yeah. I think the interest in tattoos was up and down, but I think that sailors in the 1700s were pretty covered with tattoos. But I didn't know if there was any tradition among women of. I would imagine they wouldn't have worn any kind of tattoo, but I don't know. I don't want to assume that, you know.
It's never mentioned, and it probably would have kind of gone against the idea of femininity, of constructions of femininity at the time.
Mhm,
There are a couple times that sort of the whiteness of the woman's skin is mentioned as like a marker of femininity.
mhm,
So this idea of like being blemishless, right, of
mhm,
being kind of pale, right, which was the standard for beauty at the time. So I would imagine that I would I would guess, right, that women were not getting tattoos because it was not going to be seen as ladylike or feminine.
mhm.
Um, but I actually don't know what the role of tattoos was or the extent of tattoos among the British Navy or Marines at this time. That's an
Mhm.
interesting question.
And how about jewelry? And again, going to sailors, sometimes sailors would wear, maybe an earring or something.
Hmm.
Um, how much did you come across that very often? Discussion of
No,
jewelry.
no, actually, I didn't.
Hmm.
The pirate stories that I read did not mention jewelry at all.
Hmm.
No.
Okay. Okay. And how about, was there any underground literature that you came across, made for people who wanted to hide whatever was being written about?
What do you mean? Well,
Any kind of, just like maybe a little booklet of salacious
mm.
stories, that was passed around among, small groups of friends that might discuss any of this.
I not really. What was interesting to me was precisely the fact that like anything that seemed like it was underground at all turned out to not be
Uh,
at all.
uh,
Um, so something like Fanny Hill, which we think, oh, erotic literature, this is going to be like on the down low, right, passed around from hand to hand, like Lady Chatterley's Lover in the 20th century. No. Well, unlike Lady Chatterley's Lover, it's the thing that's like everyone's read it, even though you're not supposed to, right?
mm,
So I think that was one of the really fun and interesting and maybe surprising things was to think like how people, most adults probably knew what a dildo was, and many people in places like London, big cities, would even know where to find one.
mm,
Which I was like, really, sex toys in the 18th century? Okay, I
mm,
had no idea. All right.
yeah,
But yeah, there were these like rogues dictionaries that were published,
Mhm.
and they would have slang, and they would have all sorts of information about like underground culture. But again, they weren't hard to find,
Hmm.
right? I think they appealed to people precisely because they were called things like the Rogues Dictionary or Black Guardiana,
Yeah.
these alluring names that made you feel like, ooh, I'm doing something wrong. But really, you and all your friends have already read it, and everyone's read it.
Huh. Interesting. I'm speaking with Dr. Ula Klein, author of Sapphic Crossings. You can find more information about her work at saphiccrossings.weebly.com. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you want daily book suggestions for new fiction and nonfiction studies in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mysteries, gaming, game design, film history, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Now back to the video. Did any of these, anything that you came across, was there any Gothic that included any of this?
Yes. Actually, it didn't make it into my book, unfortunately.
Oh.
But in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, there is a female character. You don't know it's a woman until quite late in the novel. It's like that big. And she's been posing as a monk, but actually she's also the devil or like an agent of the devil, as it turns out, because it's, the Gothic.
Yeah.
And in The Monk, it's all real, right? It's actual magic and evil, as opposed to like someone like Anne Radcliffe, where it's made up, right? It's like a wind moving the veil. No. For Matthew Lewis, it's real. It's the devil.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to say like if it's cross-dressing for real or if it's like a disguise within a disguise. But certainly there is like an element of sexual titillation, right? And an anti-Catholic sentiment, which was common to the Gothic, right? A lot of Gothic tales are very anti-Catholic. It was like, ooh, look at these creepy Catholics.
Yeah.
They've got, chapels in their houses, all these statues, and the statues bleed sometimes, and it's very scary. And we English Protestants are not like that, but we want to read about
it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that novel, I think the fact that like he's a monk, right, and then like there's all these stories about what are monks and nuns doing all those lonely nights by themselves, and what would happen if one of them turned out to be a woman in disguise. Yeah. But what's interesting is I was just talking about this with a medievalist who mentioned that it wasn't actually uncommon in the Middle Ages for women to dress as men so they could become monks and live as monks, because that was preferable sometimes to marriage. So I mean, that's a sidebar.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's the monk is definitely the example from the Gothic that comes to mind most prominently.
Okay. Are there, I was going to turn towards how you did your research, but are there any other significant themes that we haven't touched on yet that you'd want to mention?
Significant themes. I mean, I guess what I kind of touched on this earlier, but I'll just, reiterate the biggest thing that I found that I was really interested in, and I was a little pleasantly surprised, was just how often, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, right, fictionalized biographies, how often, non-cross-dressed women would find the cross-dresser attractive. And the cross-dresser would often be like this perfect lover, and because they were women, they would know the right thing to say to like court a woman. So the fact that they were women themselves almost made them like better lovers, right? And that was kind of exciting and interesting. to find in so many stories.
Was there a difference between whether the writer or the creator of this work was male or female?
Um, in some cases, yes. I think the novels, especially novels by women from the later part of the 18th century, um, the cross dressing is maybe like a little bit less of a part of the story. It's just kind of like it's often used symbolically to indicate like some kind of treachery or maybe like a lack of morals on the part of this character who is, going to masquerades all the time, or who is, dressing as a man and taking part in duels, which was illegal.
Hmm.
Whereas I feel like the male authors, they're often split between either, writing about these women as if they're like heroes. Look what she did. She fought for her country and she didn't get caught even though she was a woman.
Mhm.
Or they're kind of like titillating, like, ooh, look at her. She's such a good person at seducing other women. And let's read this. And it's very exciting and titillating.
Mhm.
So the kind of what you think of as like men being interested in lesbianism for the kind of sexual pleasure for men, right? Kind of performing for men. So that was an element definitely in the male authored stories that doesn't come up in the female authored ones.
Hmm. Interesting. Actually, what you were saying, for some reason, I forget when the story of Joan of Arc, where what period exactly that comes from, but I would imagine at this point, because I think she pretended to be a man, and she was a knight, and then she
Yeah.
revealed herself to be a woman, and obviously a lot of people would have known that the Joan of Arc story at this period.
hmm
So I just wonder how much, what that might have affected people's outlook on these sorts of things. That's just kind of a random thought. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. No, I feel like Joan of Arc doesn't really come up, and it might be the time difference. Like I think she dies in the early 15th century.
Yeah.
So 300 years earlier
Mhm.
or 200. Anyway, it's been a while. And she was also French and
Mm.
Catholic. So I feel
Yeah.
like English authors are not dying to compare their heroines to Joan of Arc.
Mhm.
The idea of an Amazon does come up quite a bit. It's like that kind of myth, the myth of the Amazon, the woman warrior
Mhm.
comes up. But also, again, like people kept asking me about that with regards to like the breasts. And I feel like in the stories that bring up the idea of Amazons, they never bring up that part of the myth, right? That they would cut off a breast to be better warriors or whatever. It
Mhm.
was usually like, oh, she was like an Amazon in the way that she was so strong and so good at fighting. Um, it was more about that rather than like some kind of bodily modification.
Mhm. That's interesting because I think I've heard or read that that idea of the Amazons cutting off one of their breasts is like a more recent myth that actually didn't
Yeah.
exist at the time, or like it was something that newer writers dreamt up.
Yeah, well, that would make sense then as why 18th century writers are not mentioning that at
Yeah,
all.
yeah. But that's I'd have to look into that again. But okay, so let's talk about the resources. So obviously you read um, the books, the writings that you wrote about.
Mhm.
How else did you investigate this topic?
Well, there have been some really wonderful researchers who have gone into the archives, like newspaper archives, and they've written about what they found. And I did go to the British Library and look up some of these newspaper notices, right? And they're often very short. It'd be like, oh, a group of thieves was arrested yesterday in Sheffield, and two of them were women in men's clothing.
Hmm.
And occasionally you'll get something a little bit juicier, like there was the autopsy yesterday in the town of Manchester for such and such, James Smith, who upon the autopsy turned out to be a woman who had been living as a man and working as a butcher in this community for 30 years. The wife says she had no idea. Done. Right. And so those are kind of interesting. And I don't necessarily talk about them in depth because, they're so short. But I did think that was significant evidence of the fact that people would have been familiar with the concept. So part of my argument is that these were not just like one-offs that, if you didn't read the right book, you wouldn't know about it. My argument in part is that people throughout the 18th century in England were familiar with the idea of a woman dressing as a man and passing herself off as a man. But yeah, a lot of my research was, sitting at home with a cup of tea and a book, or looking at, scans of 18th century books and pamphlets, and just reading, annotating, and kind of deciding what was going to go in the book and what wasn't, what was worth writing about and what wasn't, and then seeing what had other people already written about, because a lot of people have been writing about cross-dressing women at this time for a while. So it was kind of about, a lot of it was about taking all this resources and saying, how can I make a coherent argument about what's important about these texts and these women?
Okay. What part of the research was most enjoyable?
Most enjoyable.
Did you get to try? Did you do any sort of travel for any
I
reason?
did. Yeah, no. So I went to the British Library in London. I went to the National Library of Ireland in Dublin, and both those were lovely places to do research. And I also went to the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC, and I was actually researching Elizabeth Inchbald there because they don't just have stuff about Shakespeare there. A lot of their holdings are actually from the 18th and 19th century and the 20th century about performances of Shakespeare's plays and different editions of the plays. And as it turned out, Elizabeth Inchbald, who wrote A Simple Story, which is the book that I write about in my book, she had been an actress who had done cross-dressing roles on stage. And then kind of like after her stage career was kind of waning, she started working as an editor, and she was basically part of this collection of Shakespeare's plays that were being republished. And she was writing an introduction to every single one. So the Folger has the full set. It also has all her diaries, which are these like tiny, tiny little leather bound like pocket diaries that she, just kind of kept track of. Like she would keep track of like the weather, how much money she had, how she was feeling that day, and maybe like one other thing, like, oh, so-and-so came to see me today. Like they're very brief. And so like those diaries didn't really make it into my book per se, but just being able to hold her diaries, I mean, that was a really amazing moment, just to be like, these were held and written in by the person whose novel I'm writing about, and they're still here. That's amazing. That was really an amazing moment, like touching the past, quite literally.
Yeah, yeah. When you mentioned performing on stage, another question came to mind, which is the use of makeup. Would Was that touched on at all? I don't know how much women or even men used makeup in this period, and would that have been mentioned?
I mean, I think women used a significant amount of makeup, although of course the less you used, the more kind of, I don't know, vaunted your beauty would be, right? That you were kind of a pure, simple person. By the end of the 18th century, though, you do have, I think, a lot of people using rouge, for example. And so there is one story about the one sister dresses as a clergyman, right, to run away from home, and I guess she's a cousin, and her cousin is going to pose as her sister. They're going to pose as a brother and sister, and she's a clergyman, and the other young lady is going to be her sister. And I guess there's a mention of the fact that she's so beautiful that they have to like shade the resplendency of her face, right? They have to actually like tone down like her I guess natural blushes. And then the other sister is so kind of wan and pale that they have to give her a little bit of blush, right, as part of her disguise, I guess. So that's the one explicit mention of makeup. And then, in some of the other stories of female soldiers, they talk about darkening their faces, but they don't really say how they do it. There are some female warrior ballads where they talk about using pitch or like, cork right? Burnt cork to darken their faces, but it's not really makeup, right? It's more like the disguise, I guess.
Mhm. So I feel like I've unfortunately focused too much on these elements and kind of moved away from your approach to what does gender mean.
That's
And
okay. I mean, it's all fun to talk about, to
but
think
so
about this.
yeah, so but the question that I want to ask is how important, and I guess we have our assumptions that gender was, you have your men and your women, back then.
Hmm.
We assume that it was very strongly adhered to. Is that is that assumption correct, or was there more fluidity then than we might have expected?
I mean, I don't know that there was fluidity. I think that there was a sort of idea, right, of a binary at this time that most people felt was the true thing, and that you know before the 18th century and into like maybe the beginnings, there was this idea that if you were a woman who desired other women, that must mean that you were actually intersex, right? That you probably had an enlarged clitoris
Mm,
or undescended testicles, and that all you had to do was, wait until those testicles would descend, and then, you would be actually a man, and your desire would be kind of explained,
mm,
right? And so there was an awareness of intersex people, and there was kind of a confusion, I think, for a long time about what their status was, and different cultures
mhm,
would treat intersex people differently. And of course, in the 18th century, they're called hermaphrodites. And there's stories, right, of young women who kind of like ran around too much, they exerted too much energy as adolescents, and then like their testicles suddenly descended and their penis popped out, and it turned out, oh, actually, the reason that she was kind of into girls was because really she was a boy, and
mm,
now she's a boy, and we don't have to worry about it.
mm,
And as the 18th century progresses, that idea of kind of desire for the same sex as like a part of like the wrong gender kind of recedes a little bit, and you see more and more authors thinking about kind of a disease in the mind, right? That
mm,
it's some kind of wrong-headedness, that it's a desire that is wrong. It kind of becomes this coded as immoral, which
mm,
becomes stronger in the 19th century. And so they start thinking about desire as not rooted in like biology, right? Um, but certainly, I think most people would have at that time said, there's a gender binary, and you're either male or female, man or woman, and that's going to determine your entire life, and how you live.
mhm.
But of course, in practice, there were always people who either lived in the margins or who, didn't exactly fulfill that binary. Um, and I think what's interesting is that the texts that I write about often portray a fascination with, and even like maybe a small amount of acceptance of those people, that people were really interested in their stories, and they wanted to read about them, and they found them interesting. Um,
About
mhm.
anything about asexuality or no, non-gender. I mean, I know
Mm.
that's much, more modern ideas, but maybe there's something that you found back then that.
I'm not sure that I found anything necessarily in the text that I was writing in particular,
Mhm,
um, because I was trying to focus on texts where there was some kind of romantic liaison,
mhm,
right? Um, so I'm not sure that it comes up in this work in particular, but I would venture to say there certainly were people in the 18th century who could be thought of as asexual today.
mhm.
Absolutely.
Was there a question normally I ask what most surprised you, but I think you've touched on that. You mentioned something that really surprised you. Was there a question that you'd really like to get an answer for, and maybe you feel like you kind of feel like it's a settled question at this point, or you'd really want more? You want more information to get to this particular question that you
Hmm. That's There's so many.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. Well, it's sort of like a psychological test, like, what comes to mind when I ask that? What pops in your mind? Like, "Oh, yeah, that," you know,
Oh. Yeah,
nothing?
I mean, I would love to go back in time and talk to some of these real life women,
Mhm,
right, who had who lived at least part of their lives in men's clothing, and who pursued relationships with other women.
mhm,
Um, but I'm not sure again that there would be an answer because sexual orientation, as we think of it today, didn't exist at that time.
mm,
Um, you know, not just in the sense of, the term lesbian or transgender didn't exist then, or lesbian existed, but it was thought of as like an inhabitant of the island of Lesbos, right?
mm,
But people didn't think of themselves as straight either.
mhm,
Um, so I think, if you went back in time and talked to, Hannah Snell, right, um, who was an illiterate hosier's daughter and then joined the Marines
mhm,
after having a failed marriage where she was abandoned, right?
mhm,
And she had a baby and then it died soon after it was born. And then she joined the Marines and found out that her husband was dead. And maybe she pursued some of these women that we have in the story. Maybe it was part of her cover. Maybe that was it.
mhm,
We don't know. But if I talk to her, what would she say? Well, we don't know.
mhm. Yeah,
um, it would be hard to give those people back then the language that we have today and make them understand how we think of ourselves in these categories that were not really the same categories back then.
mhm,
Um, and I think maybe that's kind of what's exciting about history, and maybe also a little sad, right? We search for our history, looking at people in the past, but the culture has changed so much, and the language has changed so much, and how we think of ourselves has changed so much that the answers that we seek might always be a little elusive.
yeah, 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 to the point where the people experiencing it might not even know what you're talking about,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, exactly. Like with Ann Lister, right? Who's like the main. They've made a show about her called Gentleman Jack.
mhm,
There's this whole debate, right? Was she gender non-binary? Was she gender fluid or gender queer? Was she a lesbian? Some people call her the first modern lesbian. Was she transgender? And I'm not sure that if we went back in time and talked to her, if she would have an answer to that, right? I think she would have to come to the future and live here for a while
yeah,
before she could make her answer.
yeah, yeah,
And even then, she might say, well, I'm a creature of my time.
yeah, yeah. So, was there anything that had an emotional impact on you? And I know this can be maybe kind of dry, researching this, but did you come across anything that really, and that could be positive or negative, something you didn't expect to come across?
And I think the story of Charlotte Chark is really moving. Um, she was the daughter of that famed actor and theater manager, Collie Kibber, or Sibber, depending on how you pronounce it.
Mhm,
And he was so famous and so well known, and she was one of his daughters, but they had a falling out. Um, and I don't think it was ever really patched up. And so she was kind of cut off from like the family, and she made kind of like a bad marriage and eventually was on her own, taking care of her daughter. And she made some poor career choices and eventually was out of work. She couldn't work on the London stage anymore. And so her book describes, you know, her being like in abject poverty. At one point, she says she's dressing as a man to avoid her creditors.
mhm,
At one point, she's working as a sausage maker and seller to kind of make ends meet. And there are lots of descriptions of her kind of like trudging through the cold, rainy English landscape, going to these towns where they were going to be strolling players, that were going to put on a play and hope that they would get paid, because if the people didn't like it, then they might not pay them. And they've walked or taken, you know, wagons all this way.
mhm,
And at one point, yeah, she and her she and her best friend or partner, romantic partner, we don't know. She called herself Mr. Brown and her partner was Mrs. Brown. Anyway, at one point, she and Mrs. Brown have to walk something like 40 miles on foot. And she describes just how exhausted they are by the end. And they literally like don't have money to pay for a cart to take like the last couple miles. And you also know that at the same time she's trying to support her daughter. And I don't know, like that whole story was just so sad, and I wasn't writing about as much of the whole story. I was writing about the relationship as it's represented between these two women. But you just kind of feel like, man, that was a really rough life of a strolling player, especially if a woman, and kind of being like without any support, without anything to fall back on, even though you have a rich father, a rich family, well-known family in London, and they've kind of cast you off. And you're at some point almost like sounds like she's starving, So I think I was really moved by that story. I kind of wanted to give her a hug.
Which was she? I'm sorry if you said this already, but was she cast off because of her relationships or her attitudes in this regard?
I think it was a little bit of several things. I think it was the fact that she had made a name for herself on stage, playing a character that was spoofing her father. She joined a theater that was kind of in competition with where her father was working. But then also some people have speculated that her penchant for cross-dressing may have also been part of their break. So it's kind of unclear. And she never exactly says it. The book says that it's like an apology and an appeal to her father to be brought back into the fold. So of course she's not going to belabor, why they fell out in the first place. But yeah, there's a little bit of mystery about that, as far as I can tell. I know people are constantly researching, so there might be some new information out about that. But yeah, it just seemed kind of sad to me, and I was very moved by that. Her story.
Yeah, that is pretty sad. So, what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
I mean, I think one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book and that I wanted to put it out in the world was because I wanted people to know that there have always been these like gender outlaws, right? People who have challenged the gender binary, gender norms, people who have pursued the life that they wanted to have, but also that people have always known about LGBTQ people. Like this idea that, sometimes people say, oh, well, transgender is just a phase, or, homosexuality isn't real because it's made up, it's a choice. And I want to say, look, there have been people throughout history who have had same-sex relationships or who have identified with not the gender that they were born as, who have pursued these lives counter to what society expected them to do. And that's really important to recognize that history and to write about it. And also to see how, if you look closely at a lot of these texts that were written by, let's say, cisgender or straight people, that they're fascinated by these characters, that they clearly find them interesting to write about, to think about, to talk about, and just to show how crucial LGBTQ people have always been to society. And I think that that's really important for LGBTQ people now, and society now, to say, this isn't new. This has always been around. It's always been part of our culture, and our culture is enriched by these people and their stories.
Yeah. Okay, good. Did you have any trouble finishing the book or getting it published?
Well, with finishing it, maybe. I mean, it's just a process. And I think at some point you kind of get a little scared. You're like, oh, I'm going to write a book, and it's got to have all these sources, and, it's got to be double and triple checked. And am I up to it? And I think a couple years out of my PhD, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to write a book. I mean, my dissertation wasn't that great. And I talked to my mentor, and she said, you just got to do it. Just finish it. You've got most of it written, just, edit it, and don't spend too much time. Just get it out there. Right. And I was really kind of heartened by that. And I had some other friends / mentors say to me, like, it's just a book. don't make it into something bigger than it is.
Yeah.
Just finish it and get the reader reports, and then you'll know how to improve it. And it's true, I got reader reports, and both of them had suggestions. One of them had some actually quite extensive suggestions for how to address the issue of transgenderedness in the book. And so the book took on a new shape in some ways. It was a little bit reshaped through the reviewers for the press. But the press has been great. I mean, I contact UVA because the editor had actually contacted me years ago after a conference where I presented about cross-dressing women, and she said, "Hey, are you writing a book?"
Interesting.
And so I was like, "Yeah, but it's not done." So when I was finishing it, I contacted the same editor at UVA, and I said, "I think I'm ready." So yeah, and it's crazy to think that, I signed the contract with them 2 years ago, and it took another 2 years for the book to actually get published. But that's because I got the reviewer reports. I was improving, adding sources, editing, reshaping, and then there's the proofs. I was proofreading the text in the summer, and then the galley proofs were this past fall, and it's a process. But I think the biggest hump for me was like between the dissertation and then getting back to the book and saying, okay, the dissertation is not a book. No one wants to read that. To make this interesting and readable as a book, and not rather as a document, proving my ability to do research, right? It's going to need some work, and you kind of doubt yourself sometimes. You're like, oh, am I up to this? So yeah, I think that was the biggest hump to it. And then once you get over that, once you dedicate yourself to being like, okay, I can do this, and I'll just work on one chapter, and then I'll work on the next one, and then I'll work on the next one. Then you kind of get in the groove, and people have been very encouraging. And every time I talk to someone about the topic, they're very excited about it. And that's also helped me feel like it was a worthwhile project to pursue.
Yeah. Sounds like you had a lot of doubts along the way as you went chapter by chapter, almost the way you described it.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. It seems like a monumental thing to write a research book like this. And it seems such a big project. And I think that's why it really helped when someone said to me, it's just a book.
Yeah.
It's just your first book. There'll be others.
This will seem like nothing.
Yeah.
Down the line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what did you find, were you most pained by the sourcing, rewriting your style, like what part of it, or is it just the size, like you say?
I think it was the style, because it meant having to go back and reread, the stuff I had written 5 or 6 years earlier and say, oh, okay, like this, I'd be like, oh, this part is really good. Wow, I wrote that. That's great. Yeah. And then there's other parts I'm like, oh, this is really clunky and not smooth.
Yeah.
And when you're a student, you're kind of putting a lot of sources in there. You're like, and then this source said this, and then this source said this. And, in a book, no one really wants to read what other people had to say. They want to read what you have to say, right? So there was some editing that happened there. And I'm very fortunate to have a writing group that has been working with me since the end of my PhD. And we've been workshopping each other's stuff for years and years at this point. And so they were kind enough to read and reread every chapter and give me really solid feedback, so that I knew if I was going in the right direction or not. And luckily, my dissertation was not as bad as I feared. It was just, again, it's kind of like a mental thing. You're like, oh, do I really want to look at this thing that I wrote before? But yeah, I think it's just a mental block.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you adjusted your writing style to fit what was considered better, like what sort of training or and it sounds like the writing group was the main thing.
Yeah. And I would say just reading more and professionalizing, going to conferences and presenting and then publishing articles. And I feel like with each article that I published after finishing my PhD, my writing style just got better and smoother and more direct, I think. Also, I mean, making an academic argument is is a lot of work because you want to say something original that actually contributes something to the field that you're working in, but you're also trying to write in a way that a general readership would find interesting. And I think that to me was the key, right? Thinking about, what is going to be useful for this? I mean, when we publish academic books, how many people are actually going to read it cover to cover, right? But what's really, I think, heartening is that a lot of students may use this book in their undergraduate classes, in their graduate classes, and maybe they'll only read one chapter, or maybe they'll only read the part that I write about, where I'm talking about the book that they're writing a seminar paper about. But if that helps them make their argument, then that's great. And thinking about students as the audience for my book, I think really helped me with the style and making sure that it was accessible and interesting and useful, right? Because who is going to read an academic book? My friends, maybe, researchers, but also students, right?
Yeah. So now, having discussed how what you went through for this book, what's your current writing project?
Ooh. Well, I have an article that I'm revising currently, which is about pop culture on Twitter, and looking at actresses who play lesbian on screen, like Cate Blanchett or Rachel Weisz. And they're not lesbians, but they're kind of embraced by the lesbian community, which is I thought was interesting because when you have cisgender actors who are played by, or excuse me, when you have cisgender actors who play transgender actors, like that's basically at this point it's very it's thought of very badly, right? Like that you should cast a transgender actor to play that role. But the lesbian fan community has been really embracing of straight actresses who play lesbian characters in a sensitive way. So I've been working on that as a kind of pop culture exploration. But as far as the next book project, I do want to go back to the 18th century, and I want to think about tourism. I'm thinking about the idea of tourism as a queer practice and tourism as practiced by queer people in the past. And my working hypothesis is that that queer people were really crucial to the growth of tourism as a concept and as a practice. So I'm excited to do that. And I love to travel. So this topic was meant to be a way for me to get to do research and travel. So the virus has thrown a little bit of a wrench into that. But I have already done quite a bit of travel to places of, let's say, queer pilgrimage. So I might start with the places that I've already been to, and then hopefully in the next year or so, maybe in 2 years, I can plan some research trips for the additional chapters. So we'll see.
We're talking about locations globally or in a specific continent or region?
Probably a fair amount of it will be in Europe. I want to go back I've been to Italy before, but not to do research. But there was a lot of interesting stuff happening in the Naples, Pompeii, Vesuvius region in the 18th century with the discovery of some of the antiquities, and people would travel down there on their grand tours. And so you have a lot of like homosocial interaction among male travelers there. But then there's also the home of the ladies of Llangollen, were two cousins who lived in the north of Wales, and they built this beautiful house that they designed themselves and they decorated themselves. And they were kind of a tourist attraction. Even Anne Lister went and visited them. So I want to go to their house. I want to go to Anne Lister's house, Shibden Hall. So some definitely several things in England. Probably want to write about Versailles and Marie Antoinette, where I have been already. But I am kind of hoping to maybe go to the Caribbean as well and think about the role of the Caribbean as a site of tourism, and when did that happen, and what did people have to say about travel to the Caribbean. So we'll see. I haven't really explored the Caribbean side of things yet, but I would like to include that so that it's not quite so Eurocentric. We'll see. It might maybe China. I don't know. I know that people traveled there in the 18th century, so
Yeah.
that's all going to be in the research to come.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting if you think that travel allows people to basically share rooms when they might not normally, and just
True.
basically disappear, whoever you want,
Hmm.
even, straight, gay, whatever,
Hmm.
you're freer
Yeah.
to do what
Yeah,
you.
well, in a different culture too. I mean, you have Mary Wortley Montagu writing her letters, her Turkish embassy letters, and one of the things that I'm hoping to write about is the trip that she takes to the bath, the Turkish bath, and she's so surprised, but also very interested in these Turkish women who are naked and bathing together, and kind of experiencing that cultural difference,
Mhm.
and then writing about it and thinking about, what did she find interesting about that?
Okay. All right. So where can people find you online, your work, your thoughts, that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, I am on Twitter,
Hmm.
and I try to tweet mostly stuff to do with academia on
Hmm.
there. Um, my handle is at Klein Ula, so kind of reversed.
Okay.
And I do have sorry.
Can you spell that again?
Sure. It's uh, KLEINULA.
Mhm. Okay.
Yep.
And your other stuff?
Yeah, and I do have a personal website. Um, and I created a website also for my book. So if you look up, I think it's Sapphic Crossings
Mhm.
.weebly.com. I have it on there,
Okay.
and there's a link on there to my personal page, which is just my name
Mhm.
.weebly.com.
Okay.
I might not spell it out because it's a little long.
No, that's fine.
um,
That's fine. People can
but
look it up in the show notes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Um,
that's probably the easiest way to find me, to get in touch. And I did also create a fan page for Sapphic Crossings on Facebook.
yeah.
So there is that, and I think it's, let me see.
Yeah. Could you hold up the book one more time? You only had it
Sure.
halfway up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it's facebook.com/ um, Sapphic Crossings.
Yeah. Cool.
So
All right.
well,
Yep.
there we go. Yeah.
Cool. Got it.
Yeah, so I've been posting on there just a couple times a week. So if you like the page, then you'll get little snippets from the book and updates, and of course links to any other interviews about the book,
Mhm.
and places to buy it and when it goes on sale. It was
Mhm.
on sale recently, and then I'm hoping it'll be on sale again, in a few months. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, just thank you so much for having me and for letting me talk about my
Oh, yeah.
book. And it was a lot of research. It took a long time. And of course, I wasn't able to cover every single instance of cross-dressing in 18th century literature. So if I left out any of your favorite books, I'm sorry. Um, but I had to cut myself off somewhere.
No. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. I also noticed your Star Wars stuff back there.
Yeah, so I'm an amateur painter. So this this BB-8 is my work.
Wow. Okay. Nice. I wasn't. It kind of looked like, I didn't know if it was a box for the figure,
No,
or
no,
but.
it's a little canvas. I painted it with acrylic paints, for a Star Wars art contest that I participated in some years ago, when that movie came out. So
Looks really
yeah,
good. Yeah.
definitely a Star Wars fan.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. There's a lot of us out there. um, all right. Well, thanks again for speaking with me.
Yeah, thank you.
In the next episode, I speak with David Arnold about his new science fiction survival novel, The Electric Kingdom. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.